And today on the show, it's going to be a conversation that Kelly and I are going to have around the topic of deglobalization. Kelly, first of all, thanks for joining me today.
Oh, absolutely. I'm looking forward to this conversation because it's like every major news story we've
Yeah.
been covering rolled into one conversation.
Yeah, we feel like we've been talking about this for a while, so we thought, why not just hit the record button, have a chat,
Absolutely.
and just share some of the things that we're hearing and seeing. And the one thing for sure, as we record this here, the end of June, is that the topic of deglobalization isn't getting any quieter or less important.
Yeah.
There's hardly a week that goes by without something else happening.
I know I've been joking with my Art of Supply guests for a while that it should be standard practice to have to hold up the newspaper at the start of every single recording session just to document, like, what are the headlines? What's the date?
Yeah.
Yes, we're all still here. Sort of proof of life before the conversation starts.
It's funny, we never really used to do that, because often we record podcasts in advance of them going out, and because a lot of the topics are so evergreen. But yeah, because of the pace of change, I
Yeah.
find myself more and more date checking. It's almost like if some of this isn't as relevant anymore when it gets published, that's my excuse.
Exactly. That's right. Don't hold it against us.
Yep. So, as we think about the topic of deglobalization, first of all, what is deglobalization? I think that from my perspective, it's really just about reshoring, nearshoring, just taking out some, reducing some level of dependence on a certain country or certain area. It doesn't necessarily mean let's bring everything back to within 5 miles of your assembly plant, but it's just reducing some of the probably over reliances on certain areas of the world that a lot of our supply chains have come to have built in.
Yeah. I think that's an interesting thing to start right off the bat by questioning, because I do think it's one of those topics where, in a lot of cases, when we say deglobalization, what we actually mean is ABC, anywhere but China.
Mm-hmm.
Some companies will go to an additional level and either say we want to move closer or say we want to be working in less international locations. But very broadly, if we're specific, for most companies, at least in North America, deglobalization means trying to be less dependent on China.
Yeah, I think that's the elephant in the room, isn't it?
Yeah.
That's what most are looking at. But I do think that there are other regions where we have got we've over focused supply chains, and that's not necessarily even. I think it's important to mention it's not necessarily just product,
Absolutely.
direct materials. It can relate to indirect services as well. So things like where your data centers are or your call centers are things that you're really dependent upon as a business that you have also for probably unit economics
Mm.
built in or contracted for services in lower cost countries that are concentrated. So I think that is a part of it as well. But when it comes to physical manufacture, I think a lot of it is in, how do we move away from a China-only strategy?
Yeah. And I think it's important that you bring up sort of the services angle on this, because yes, we're very focused on deglobalization right now because of tariffs and trade differences, geopolitical conflicts and wars that are happening. But this is also something that's happening somewhat more cyclically all the time in the background,
Yeah.
right? Because the world will sort of discover a new location where, oh my gosh, it's great. We can move this service or we can get this product made or manufactured in this area. But then all of the companies rushing in to take advantage of that, of course, start to raise demand, which raises cost. And so some clever company goes off and finds an alternate location and sort
Mm-hmm.
of brings that up to pace. So this is something that's constantly happening in much more discrete cycles all the time. What we're probably feeling now is certainly the concern about the abruptness or the need to consciously deglobalize,
Yeah.
but also the fact that all companies and industries are pretty much going through it at the same time.
In the conversations that you have on Art of Supply, do you hear is there a reliance on moving from one country to another? Is it that it's just it's the moving out of China but moving to other countries within Asia as an example that is close to China, or it's let's move from a far out location and bring everything home, or bring everything, within a country that's on our borders that might necessarily be home? Do you feel there's a bias towards one or the other at the moment?
Well, it's interesting. It's almost like you have to answer the question two ways. If you look at what people are talking about, oh, yes, everybody's going to nearshore, reshore, or friendshore everything in the
Hmm.
next 18 months, right? That's what everybody's talking about. When you talk to the operational people, though, and you look at the viability of some of the changes that have to be made, I think even if we go to the example of China plus one, we would say, okay, we accept the reality. We can't just completely pull out of China. So we're going to somewhat diversify by moving some of our services or manufacturing capacity to another location. Then everybody started digging into the details and found out a lot of the companies in countries like Vietnam, for instance, are actually owned and operated by Chinese firms.
Yeah.
So you've sort of diversified in name only. I think the other thing people find, and you have to give career supply chain professionals credit for this, as they dig, they realize just how complicated all of this is going to be to do, finding out that, okay, India is a fantastic alternative for a lot of these services and products, but maybe the infrastructure's not
Yeah.
right there, right? Or the communication skills, or you figured out how to manage some of the cultural differences in one part of Asia, but now trying to do the same thing in India, you're sort of readjusting. I think the recognition that what can be done practically and the best way to do it without disrupting the whole operation are sort of different things from what we're all actually either hoping to do or talking enthusiastically about doing.
Yeah, I think there's definitely a difference between um, how deglobalization and the movement of supply chains is portrayed in the press by
Yeah.
those who are not involved in supply chain and procurement, like we are, and everybody that's listening is,
Yeah.
versus the reality of that's all very nice and maybe utopian. But the reality is going to be a lot different because you don't just rebuild supply chains overnight.
Oh, no.
In fact, you
No.
probably can't ever rebuild some of the supply chains because of the outsourcing of expertise to these locations.
Yeah.
You see all the memes going around about bringing things back to America that are currently in China. The reality is that a lot of things that are in those countries will never ever come back, no matter what. We might, the press may want us to believe.
Yeah. Well, and it is funny because we have the advantage of, well, okay, sorry, Phil, I'm dating us. Not everybody listening and watching has the advantage. You and I, and a
Yeah,
lot of our colleagues have the advantage that we watched the globalization part happen. I
yeah,
mean, this has been happening for decades. And
yeah,
no, you and I weren't working in the 60s when some of this started to happen. But as far as a conscious, centralized procurement and supply chain, driving things to optimal locations around the world, managing shared services centers overseas in low cost countries. We watched a lot of that happen. We understand the evaluations that were gone through before those decisions were made. So it doesn't necessarily make it easier for us to unwind it, but we both understand the complexity that was
mhm,
involved and the drivers that were involved, but also how long it took. I mean,
yeah.
it took decades, not just for the decisions to be made and the work to start and the impact to be felt. We're not going to unwrap that in 12, 18, 24 months. It's just going to take a lot longer than I think people would like to believe.
Yeah, and we're not going to be able to truly deglobalize.
No.
There will therefore be new dependencies on new locations, and that's where the geopolitics comes into it. Of okay, who are going to be the chosen friendly locations that we're going to,
Right.
build new reliances on if we look to move away from China, which then gives leverage to those nations, as China does. So you kind of pushing one problem today to maybe you are diversifying your risk
Mm.
because now you are reliant on 4 or 5 different trade partners versus one major trade partner, but it's not going to make the problem go away.
Yeah. Now, question for you, because I think you have more global operational experience than I do. Do you think there's an advantage for companies that are truly operating globally? Now, you might not have procurement everywhere, but you
Yeah,
have company employees in lots of different places versus, well, Art of Procurement. We're
yeah,
based in the United States, right? But we do have a global team. Is there an advantage that goes to companies that actually have an operational presence in different parts of the world versus somebody that's completely located here in the United States and is simply trying to interact with global suppliers and supply chains?
Oh, 100%. I think that when you have boots on the ground in all these locations around the world, um, it you have local relationships to understand what those supply chains look like and how you can, either build relationships with local companies that helps mitigate some of the risks, or that just gives you insight into what those risks might be a little bit more ahead of time. Whereas in the US, you're kind of operating from a satellite basis where you don't necessarily have those. You don't have the inbuilt knowledge of individual, country locations and supply chains. If you're a good example, you talked about India earlier, and India is somewhere that most listeners will know that I lived for a while. If you're a US company that are thinking about, well, do I move either some services into India or some manufacturing into India? You might not be as aware of, where are the kind of corridors that you can do that do have the infrastructure to support, still a just-in-time kind of supply chain, or that have the infrastructure to support, power generation backups and, transportation of workers in typhoon conditions and things. Whereas obviously if you're on the ground, that, and you can kind of build that into your decisions on where you might want to either dual source or to move things to make that location viable. And if you don't know that, you might just write off that location thinking that, well, the infrastructure is poor there, so that's already off the map, when it's not necessarily the case. If you're a global organization as well, it means you likely have global manufacturing yourself. So you can shift manufacturing around into other locations, based on where the risks is not something you can do overnight. But I think about a conversation that I had recently on a podcast still to be released. And I'm not sure if it will be released before or after this goes live, with Jabil. But Jabil is a huge international manufacturing organization, amongst many other things that they do. And we were talking about tariffs and the impact of tariffs and what that does to their business. And, because they have these manufacturing sites all around the world, it just gives them a lot more flexibility to kind of move things around, and not be kind of beholden to one particular supply chain route or a couple of supply chain routes because they just have manufacturing in one country, for example.
Yeah. And thinking about that flexibility, I mean, you can call it flexibility, agility, resilience. It all kind of means the same thing. This is where we start getting into the place where supply chain and procurement come together, because yes, there's where is it ideal to have services take place or have products manufactured, but then there's how much duplication do we want so that we're making sure we have the ability to move, or we have a true independent backup source, because all of that does usually increase the cost somewhat of getting things made, even if it's just very simply because you're splitting your volume. And so starting to think about, okay, there's sort of the understanding of the geopolitics and the economic and trade dynamics. There's the literal logistics of moving things around. But when you get down into the procurement decision making, being able to analyze, okay, if we segment this much of the volume, there's different costs and locations, there's different lead times, there's all kinds of different considerations. It's an incredibly complex problem.
Yeah, I think the role for procurement here is, first and foremost, is an educational one. I think, again, it differs a little bit on direct materials versus indirect services. In the direct materials space, oftentimes components are designed with individual suppliers, although they shouldn't be, but that is often the reality, by engineers who are designing, the best gold-plated thing that could ever fit into this assembly, because for them, that's what's the most important is functionality, quality, innovation. By the time that's designed, it's sometimes too late to get creative around what your supply chain looks like.
Yeah.
And so the first kind of role that we have is to ensure that everybody is on the same page, whether that's from a direct materials, again, perspective, engineering, program management, sales, everyone needs to be together to understand the cost of optionality, but also the options of optionality, if you will, so that that decisions are made, intentionally around what the supply chain might look like versus we've always done it like this, or I've not really given much consideration to suppliers and who's going to provide this because I'm just trying to design the best bill of material. And that's a big role that we can play. On the indirect side, I think that there's probably more understanding at least when you're talking people and services based, of the connection between location and risk, because a stakeholder is managing that relationship every day. A designer is not necessarily managing a supplier relationship every day once a bill of material has been designed and you're offering into production. But a budget holder who is outsourcing to a particular location is living the impact of that decision every day. So it's probably a little bit easier to bring in folks in the indirect, or when you're buying indirect services, to think about all those different options. But I see that as being our primary role, certainly in organizations where there isn't that kind of team effort to figure out, okay, what do we do about this?
Yeah. And this is an interesting split between direct and indirect, because as you were talking about sort of the direct material side of it, it actually reminded me of one of the things, and I think you actually were the one that said it back during COVID. One of the advantages was nobody had any idea what was going on or what was going to happen. It sort of created this blue skies. I don't know. Everything's crazy, but everything's crazy anyway. Let's try it. And it sort of created this environment where everybody embraced the sure, why not? Go ahead, let's try it. I do think not that this approaches COVID in terms of impact, but in terms of executive level mindset, I think, yes, especially if you specialize in a very few direct materials, you've got unbelievable expertise. You've probably got the board where the lights are blinking, right? You know where the risks are happening, even in your own mind. But with some of this, we're ending up with relatively small components, relatively small materials, even things at the rawest end of the supply chain. And we're not used to having to deal with those as disruptions. So even the C-suite in some cases is getting back to that, I don't know, like, what are literally all of our options? What should we think about trying? It seems like an exceptional opportunity for procurement to get involved and say, okay, some of things are more qualified than others. Some of them are closer to our comfort zone than others. But here's literally every single idea we were able to come up with. What does everybody think?
Yeah, I mean, this is where risk management, and I think that COVID forced a lot of organizations to move on, but I don't necessarily say that all organizations still think in this way. Is that selecting the suppliers through which you have that all-encompassing view of risk with is not based on how much money they spend with you. And that's, when I think about the past, that's a lot of times how these decisions were made. And, we disparagingly call spend under suppliers where we spend money under a certain amount as, well, that's just tail spend. And just being tail spend means that's just transactional or tactical. I can't really drive any savings from it. I don't really need to worry about it too much. Now, on one side, that's where a lot of innovation comes from. But on the other hand, that's where a lot of risks are missed. And I know I always say you can't manage all risks at all times, but that's when we're starting to look at, within that, you can have something that doesn't cost you much money, but that is completely integral, like fasteners, for example.
Absolutely.
You can have a specialty fastener that is not just available off the shelf somewhere. And I've been there and done that, and had the experience of a supplier in Taiwan with fasteners. They can bring down your entire manufacturing facility, if there's a problem. So that makes it harder because you've got to open the purview of where the risk is, and it's not just spend related. And also you've got to again educate the stakeholders that this isn't just some off the shelf thing. And this is where you need to be able to put more focus when it comes to that.
The example that I always think of with that, I can still actually see the image in my mind from a newspaper article with a massive parking lot full of Ford F-150s, completely done, air quotes done, but could not be sold because they didn't have the blue oval.
Right.
has nothing to do operationally with that vehicle, but the company was not going to deliver them. Many of them had been sold and they could not be moved. It makes you start to rethink, as you said, what is critical. And I think maybe as we pull it back to procurement, it's almost like you have to think peripherally. You can't just be like, okay, well, I buy this fastener because this is the best fastener and I'm going to have a good relationship and we're going to make sure it's designed right. Okay, how does this fastener fit into the whole? And understanding either the services or the parts or the components or the materials that have to connect with that fastener, or the things that would be held back if that fastener wasn't available.
Yeah.
It's not enough just to know, can we still get the fastener on time at the right price? It's what else is affected by the availability.
And what are the substitutes? Like a good category strategy would consider, what are your substitutes and are there possible substitutes? In some industries, that's not necessarily possible because there's a regulatory process that you need to go through to get approvals to be able to use substitutes. So do you identify that up front, and then when you're making your submissions for new products, you're making multiple submissions based on different manufacturing methods, as an example. So you have that, but that's all a lot of extra cost that most are probably not willing to take. And all this is pointing us back to deglobalization being a nice soundbite.
Yeah.
But is the reality that we just have to have more of a focus on risk management and risk mitigation in lieu of being able to change and move too much around and to move too much, closer to us?
Yeah. And especially in a time where we've talked about this for a long time, but less and less procurement teams are made up of category experts.
Mm-hmm.
And so the educational process of understanding alternatives for that fastener, if someone was truly dedicated, I'm the fastener guy, like this is my whole world, I know everything about all these fasteners, you could be like, oh yeah, hang on page 47 of whatever, right, ordering guide, there's other ideas in there. But if you just stepped in, looked at data, worked with a stakeholder, got a contract in place for fasteners, and now you're moving on to oven mitts, you're at a serious disadvantage because you don't necessarily have the context and you may not have the time to go build up the knowledge required to figure that out quickly.
Yeah, even as a buyer in direct materials, I was a generalist. So I had no idea about all the ins and the outs of how these things worked. I bought a lot of plastics, and then I bought a lot of electromechanical components. And I was 100% completely reliant on the expertise of my engineering team, to help guide me and help me understand what was possible and what wasn't possible. That relies on strong relationships, but it also is a little difficult because you don't necessarily know when to push back, and when folks are telling you because it aligns with the suppliers they want to go with, or what the designs that they want to engineer in, and things like that. So this definitely isn't easy, and it's why it really needs kind of that team, the team all being aligned on solving the challenge, which is what happens if we can't get our our component A, B, or C, or our service A, B, and C when we want it, because of really geopolitical issues, which often happen overnight.
Yeah. And a lot of this comes back to, procurement's focused on cost internally, but it actually seems like it might be a good time. This is something we discussed with Darshan Dekmuth the other day from Procurability, is having a closer relationship with sales so that we can understand, and I'll make the assumption that sales has this information, if the cost on something is going up and we're doing everything we can to control it, but there's only a certain extent to which you can lid it without going to an alternate product, what will the market bear? Right? Consumers, and granted, this is business consumers and also personal consumers, and there's different tolerance levels, but how much additional cost are they willing to accept to have the product in the hand? Or if you start getting into things like the motivation of it being domestically built, or things around sustainability reduction, I think for procurement to have that other piece of the picture is an interesting addition to the conversation as well.
Well, there's definitely stories to be told around sustainability and and shortening supply chains,
Yeah.
and from a PR perspective, talking about the made locally as there's more of a push for supporting local economies, the economies that you're based in, but that does come with an increased cost.
Yeah.
And we've, even before the last year or two, you've always thought about, everybody says it would be nice for things to be not made in China, but are they willing to spend,
Right.
double the price on buying something from, the supermarket? And, that's the real tell, is the consumer willing to pay for that? And I think the answer in most cases is no.
Yeah.
And I think bringing sales is very important. At the end of the day, the conversation has to be with sales, because you're essentially increasing your cost. And so, in a high margin business, that's obviously a lot easier. In a low margin business, I think about automotive.
Mm.
We'd be pushed, because the margins were so slim. Every single time, for example, we'd have simple design changes that would require an increase in cost that were requested by the customer, or the OEM in this case, which would have an increase in cost, but they would still refuse to pay for that increase in cost, even though they requested the change, that drove the additional cost.
Yeah.
There's always that kind of backwards and forwards between your end customers when you're making design changes or changes to supply chain. So you've either got to bake that in up front, and then the question again comes to, is that going to be market competitive?
Yeah.
Or what is your customer willing to pay for?
Yeah.
Now your customer's going to want it all. They're going to not want to pay for it all.
Yeah.
But,
Everything but for free.
but they're going to fine you $1 million a minute that the manufacturing line is down because something happened where you couldn't get something to them in time.
Yeah. Now, the interesting thing of that, because we kind of took the curve and we went to direct, if we take this idea of costs going up despite all of procurement's efforts and loop it back around to the indirect side of things, now we're probably having the conversation with finance, although it does hit sales, right? Because that overhead has to be covered somewhere, but a slightly different conversation with different motives, different tracking in terms of impact to the business. It would be interesting to be having those sort of two sets of conversations in parallel, because it's truly procurement that's likely affecting both. And yet it's going to hit the business and their ability to sell and generate revenue in different ways.
I want to kind of shift to wrapping up a little bit. I think about, we've kind of talked about deglobalization, and we've talked on the podcast about deglobalization being, a generational trend. So I think it's here and it's real, and it's not going to go away. But it's not like we can just, as we talked about, lift up, move a supply chain, we're done, and everything is good. So if you put your putting your crystal ball in front of you, where in your opinion are we going to be, in a year or 2 years time, as we're talking about this trend? Are we going to have made big strides? Are we going to still be talking about it, in similar terms to what we're talking about it today?
My gut is that we're still going to be talking about it in similar terms to what we are today.
Yeah.
I think there will be very pointed things, like, for instance, pharmaceuticals is a huge concern, right?
Yeah.
Maybe there's some risk-related, regulatory-related changes that happen there. I think, though, without regulation, without literal inavailability of critical materials, we're likely to just keep talking and at least in that time frame, not be able to make the kinds of big changes that we want to see.
Yeah, and I'm kind of with you. I think that there'll be things that there'll be a sharper focus on items that are considered to be subject to national security.
Yes.
The access to materials is related to national security, and that will be where the focus is, and that may be where regulatory requirements come in that force kind of the movement and the force the increased cost, and ultimately everybody recognizes that that's a trade-off that's worth the investment. For general business, I think that with you, it's going to be where there's opportunistic ways when you're building something new and you have the opportunity to look for new suppliers, then there'll be conversations around, can we bring that closer to home and what's the cost trade-off? But it's going to be a very, very slow walk, I think.
Yeah. Well, if anybody listening or watching has a global ball with better resolution than ours has, and has a point of view on this, definitely let us know. But I think for the time being, it's going to be understanding what we can control, doing
Yeah.
everything within our power to at least share the information about it, and just continuing to watch all these stories and figure out how they directly impact our companies.
Yeah, and we'll keep on looking out for, as things change. Um, Obviously, we're always looking out for the stories and the angles, and
Absolutely.
as perspectives change, or if we see other organizations doing some interesting things in this space and accelerating probably faster than what we believe will happen, then we'll definitely be bringing those stories to you. And I know that you cover this all the time on Art of Supply as well. So a quick plug for Art of Supply.
Yeah, which thank you. I'm almost torn sometimes. It's like, it's not that I want anything bad to happen. It's just that I know bad things are going to happen. And it's so incredibly interesting when it happens. So definitely not wishing for anything bad. Would love for everything to be super smooth. But when crazy, unpredictable things happen, we can at least share information with people about it.
All right. Well, with that, let's wrap up. Thank you, Kelly, for joining me.
Absolutely. Great conversation.
Yeah, and thanks everyone for listening in. We'll be back, of course, next week with another Art of Procurement. But until then, I hope you have a good week and take care. Thanks, everybody.